Crystal goblets caught the candlelight like captured fireflies, as 12 members of the Whitmore family lifted their glasses for grace. The wine, a deep crimson, turned slow circles in each bowl. In the doorway between kitchen and dining room stood Clara, hands folded over her apron, eyes steady. The grandfather clock in the parlor chimed 7, every note hanging in the humid Mississippi air like a warning no one could hear. The Whitmore Plantation sprawled over 3,000 acres outside Natchez, where the river curved like a serpent's spine. Judge Cornelius Whitmore ruled it as he did his courtroom, with iron conviction. His wife, Margaret, presided over the big house with what she liked to call Christian firmness. Their 4 grown children had returned for the judge's 62nd birthday, bringing spouses and little ones. Laughter rolled through the halls. Somewhere in the noise a mockingbird rehearsed stolen songs. Beneath it all floated a faint metallic tang no one recognized. Clara had come to this house 11 years earlier, purchased in New Orleans, and torn from 2 little girls she would never see again. In the Whitmore kitchen, she became a set of perfect hands, stirring stocks, kneading bread, coaxing flavor from thyme and onion, until the judge boasted that his table was the finest in Adams County. That reputation was her camouflage. So was patience. The rat poison had been easy to buy. The big house always claimed rats, and a black woman paying for arsenic at the general store raised no questions. For 3 months Clara portioned it away in a hollowed gourd, tucked behind the flour sacks. She learned dosages by listening through doorways when the doctor visited, dust cloth in hand, eyes lowered, mind busy. She tested fractions on stray dogs, then refined her arithmetic. Enough to kill, not enough to warn, candles hissed. Plates arrived. "Pass the duck," Margaret said, supervising a carousel of silver. A wine reduction, glossy and elegant, washed its skin. Cream clung to vegetables in a pale ribbon. The birthday cake waited in the kitchen, sugared and proud beneath a glass dome. "Grandmother, these taste funny," 6-year-old Emma murmured, pushing potatoes across her plate. "Nonsense," Margaret replied. "Clara's cooking is above reproach." Judge Whitmore raised his glass for a toast, his 3rd of the evening. "To family, to prosperity, to the natural order of things." His voice thickened. He misread the weight in his tongue and blamed the wine. At 7:45, Emma retched onto the tablecloth. Her mother sprang to catch her and felt her own knees turn to sand. Across the table, the judge's face flushed an alarming plum. He tried to stand. His hands found his throat. A chair scraped. Someone gasped. Another coughed pink foam into a napkin embroidered with W's. The youngest Whitmore son crawled for the door and collapsed inches short of the threshold. "The food," someone choked. "We've been poisoned." All heads turned toward the kitchen. The doorway was empty. Chaos struck in waves. China shattered. Silver skittered. The bell Margaret shook to summon servants rang clear and bright, a useless hymn. The clock counted seconds with polite indifference. Clara, who had watched this room more closely than any judge ever studied a witness, moved through the back corridor, down the service steps, and into night. Inside, agony assembled its orchestra. Arsenic is not theatrical. It is systematic. Nausea, cramping, a fire in the gut that climbs until it steals breath and reason. Sweat slicked the polished floors. Magnolia scent drifted through open windows and turned sour against the stench of bile and fear. Along the quarter road, lamplight pricked the dark. No one ran for help. A footman paused in the hall, staring at the judge as he dragged himself across a Persian rug that cost more than the footman would see in a lifetime. In the kitchen, 6 enslaved workers heard the silver bell, looked at one another and returned to their pots as if they hadn't. Old Moses, 3 fingers gone to the judge's temper, sat on the porch step and listened to the sounds from the big house, his face unreadable as a gravestone. Clara followed moonlit paths she had memorized while gathering herbs, every bend mapped over years of service. In her bundle, a second dress, forged papers for a free woman named Sarah Coleman, and $37 lifted in discreet increments from Margaret's drawer. She had lightened her skin with lye just enough to confuse witnesses. She had reshaped her hair. She had thought of everything but interruption, and tonight even interruption turned obedient. Back in the dining room, the judge found a shard of clarity between convulsions and stared at his father's portrait above the mantel. The old man had died suddenly at dinner 2 decades earlier. Whitmore's face tightened around a thought he could not articulate. Had the first death been a rehearsal for this one? Save the children, Margaret wheezed, reaching with a hand that could still command a household, yet could not steady a spoon. But the arithmetic of the meal had no mercy left to give. The sauces carried the verdict. The cake sealed it. The law of the table for once did not belong to the judge. By 9, half the family had slipped into silence. Those still conscious watched their future arrive in the bodies they loved, minute by measured minute. James Whitmore's loyally hand scrawled on a napkin, "Clara did this," as if naming the storm could stop the rain. In the quarters, Ruth, the head housemaid, whispered to Samuel the blacksmith that Clara had meant only to strike the judge. Something had changed that morning. One death had proved too small for a ledger written in daughters. At 10, candles guttered low. Shadows danced on bodies that no longer could. The room cooled. The bell lay still. The staff came at last, not to rescue but to witness. They stood in a careful semicircle, faces carved from patience. No triumph, no pity, just the kind of memory that never fades. At 11:47, 12 Whitmores lay dead in their finery. The birthday cake sat untouched, but for the mark of a collapsed face. Wax pooled like thawed fat around the drowned wicks. Outside, Spanish moss rubbed the windows with a whisper, soft as river water. The grandfather clock ticked once and carried on. Down by the trees that leaned toward the river, Clara rinsed flour from beneath her nails in a black mirror stream, the current taking the last white dust of her kitchen life. Behind her, a house of law and habit had gone mute. Ahead, the night opened onto swamp track and ferry dock, and names that were not hers. Dawn would ask questions. Riders would scour roads. A doctor would arrive too late with a tidy Latin word for what had happened. A sheriff would insist on order where none remained. People would say the servants should have run for help. People would argue whether a mother's rage can be measured in grains. But for now there was only the steady hush of water, and a woman who had learned to wait. Clara tightened her shawl, adjusted the stolen gloves that hid the telltale burn on her left hand, and stepped into the path she had drawn, one patient step at a time, toward a freedom she had purchased with arithmetic, intention, and a ladle. Morning reached the Whitmore plantation, like a held breath finally exhaled. The rooster's call broke clean across the fields, indifferent to the 12 bodies cooling in the big house. Dew strung silver along the cotton rows. A breeze pushed magnolia scent through open windows, where it braided with the sour whisper of sickness that never made it to prayer. In the quarters, the first eyes opened to a day that did not know its own name. Ruth rose before anyone knocked, the habit of a lifetime stronger than sleep. She lit a stub of candle, washed her face in a tin basin, and stared at the woman who looked back, 35, careful, a ledger of secrets pressed into the skin around her eyes. On a shelf sat a locked box of scraps, bits of ribbon and thread, a dull pencil, an ink recipe written in a hand that had learned to keep its letters small. On the wall hung the keys to every room except the judge's study, where the documents lived, deeds, bills of sale, proofs that a life could be carried in a pocket and traded like a tobacco hogshead. Ruth dressed, tied her kerchief tight, and stepped into a dawn that felt like stepping onto a thin-skinned drum. By 5:30, the quarters hummed low, uncertain. Samuel the blacksmith stood outside his door with arms folded, that iron back built by other people's needs. Old Moses leaned on his cane, 3 fingers missing from the right hand that once rubbed linseed into wagon wheels. Children gathered like small shadows behind their mothers' skirts. The question passed between them without a mouth to carry it. Report the deaths and face the world's appetite for blame, or run now and trade one terror for another. Ruth didn't give them time to choose badly. Jupiter, she said, and the tall field hand stepped forward, eyes already braced. Saddle the bay. You're riding to Turner's with news of a sickness. Tell it straight, but only the part that helps. Family took ill at supper. We tried everything, praying and vinegar and cool cloths. By the time a messenger could find the doctor, it was too late. She pressed a folded paper into his palm. If they ask about Clara, you say nothing, because there's nothing to say. She was sold 2 weeks back. Her voice did not waver on the lie. Jupiter nodded once, the oath in it older than law. He swung onto the horse and cantered down the lane, the morning sharpening around the hooves' drum. Inside the big house, silence had a weight. The dining room looked staged and then smashed, place settings askew, silver slicked with what no polish could forgive, candles guttered into small ponds. Margaret's bell lay on its side, a useless instrument. The clock in the parlour kept a tidy beat, as if someone had wound it inside another life and forgotten to stop it. Ruth, Letty, and two of the kitchen women moved through the rooms like they were still on duty, aprons on, sleeves rolled, faces plain. They righted chairs, closed gaping shutters, washed what could be washed. They lifted the judge from the cake with hands that had carried everything else he'd ever demanded, and arranged the bodies with the same care they had given to linens. Letty wept real tears over Rachel and her little Emma, the salt of grief indistinguishable from fear on her tongue. "We need papers," Ruth said, low. "We need a bill of sale." "You can't forge that," Letty whispered. "You'll hang us all. We've been hanging from something since the day we were born." "Keys," Ruth said, and her hand found the ring at her waist. She led them to the forbidden door. The study smelled of men who believed in ownership. Ink, leather, pipe smoke, the quiet swagger of a sealed envelope. Ruth closed the shutters, lit one lamp and laid a sheet of paper on the desk. She mixed coffee grounds with a drip of grease to brown the edges of blank pages. She lifted a ledger and copied a signature she had practiced by candlelight on the underside of a flour sack. Cornelius Whitmore, the loop on the C lazy and proud, the tail of the S cutting back like a hook. The words she wrote were simple, the kind that had unmade more families than storms. Bill of sale. One Negro woman, Clara, age approximately 30, transferred to Belmont Estate, Georgia. Sam received August 5, 1847. Letty ground her knuckles into her eyes. "God forgive us. God can find us when the papers are done," Ruth said. She waved the page over the lamp, let heat draw a little age into the lie, then pressed the plantation seal into red candle wax. The crest bit like teeth. By 7, Jupiter returned with company. Riders came down the lane, Turner's overseer, 2 men from his yard, and a boy who looked at everything and understood none of it. They took one look at Ruth's onion-reddened eyes and pushed past her into the dining room. Hats clutched like shields. "Lord have mercy," the overseer breathed, although Mercy had never known his name. "Send for Sheriff Donovan," he told the boy, "and the coroner." The boy took off like the word itself had chased him. Ruth set water to boil. She laid out cups. "Work is a raft." She climbed on. Sheriff William Donovan arrived at 9:43 with dust on his boots and 2 deputies at his shoulders. He brought Dr. Marcus Webb, the county coroner, a careful man with Philadelphia schooling and a gaze that could counter lies' breaths. Webb took off his coat without drama and rolled up his sleeves. He moved through the house picking up a clue at a time. The cherry flush on dead skin, the pupils narrowed to pins, the foam dried at the mouths like lace that had forgotten its beauty. He did not hurry. He did not speak until he had to. "Arsenic," he said finally, "not to anyone exactly." "In quantity." Donovan turned to Ruth. "Who cooked?" "We all did," she answered. "Clara made the sauces before she was sold. I finished the vegetables. Samuel carved. Letty oversaw the table." The truth swaddled the lie. Both warmed under the same fire. "Show me the kitchen," Donovan said. They had scrubbed it until the planks shone. The iron pots sat in their places like obedient soldiers. The pantry smelled of flour and cloves, nothing else. Behind the flour sacks, because cruelty rarely hides its tools, sat a tin of rat poison with exactly the amount listed on the receipt 6 months back. Webb crouched and stared. Donovan squinted at the ledger nail where the purchase slip hung. Proper, innocent. "Who keeps the accounts?" he asked. "The missus," Ruth said, and if her voice tightened on the S, no one heard it. Webb stood and brushed at his knees. On the floor near the door lay a single bruised magnolia petal. He picked it up with 2 fingers, thinking not of flowers but of place. Magnolia trees by the river path, not by the kitchen door. Someone had moved through night where they had no right to walk. He kept the petal and his thought in the same quiet pocket. By noon, the yard filled with the rituals of consequence. Word had galloped ahead of the sheriff. Carriages appeared like accusations. Turner himself arrived, face pale under heat. 2 minor cousins materialized from nowhere with lawyers like crows on a fence. Questions came cheap and fast. Answers cost more. Donovan separated the staff one by one, sat them in the study chair, and asked the same set, "Where were you? What did you see? What did she say?" The habit of survival does not break for a badge. The housemaids smoothed their skirts and looked at their hands. Samuel stared past the sheriff's ear at a corner of the ceiling, where a crack curled like a river. Old Moses folded the stump of his hand into his palm and shook his head at the right times, nodded at the others. Thomas, the young footman, spoke softly and let sorrow dull his edges. Clara been acting strange? Donovan probed. Since her girls were sold, Thomas answered, and grief made truth usable, but we don't know nothing past our chores. Ruth waited her turn like a defendant who knows the verdict and insists anyway on dignity. Donovan held up the bill of sale. "Oh, you presented this," he said. "Yes, sir. The seal is proper. Yes, sir. Why wasn't I told of the transfer?" "I keep the house, Sheriff. I don't keep the county." Webb watched her hands, the way the ink stain shadowed her left middle finger, the way she pressed a cloth into that hand, as if remembering a burn that had learned to ache even in memory. He watched the script on the bill and filed away the curl of the G and the hook on the S. Patterns survive the bodies that make them. Outside, the sun climbed, indifferent to law. Flies found the cracks in shut windows and sang their single song. In the quarters, the debate restarted in whispers. Run tonight while the roads are thick with strangers, or wait this out under a net of questions. They will look for a body to hang, Samuel said. If they cannot find one, they will make one. Ruth said nothing. She was learning that leadership has two voices, one for commands, one that rests like a hand on a shoulder. Near 3 o'clock, Webb began his autopsies in the cool of the cellar, where the stone walls borrowed the river's patience. He spoke Latin softly to himself as he opened bodies whose owners had never learned a second language, and he measured what could no longer be measured by the living. Every finding said the same word: deliberate. Donovan walked the property with a deputy and returned with dust and dissatisfaction. "Roads are clean," he told Webb. "No prints we can trust, too many feet. If she ran last night and far." He looked toward the river. "Or not on a road at all." At dusk, the undertaker came with plain boxes and a quiet crew. The Whitmores rode from their own house flat and final, escorted by men who would not speak their names, except to carve them shallow in wood. The staff stood on the porch in a row, eyes down, faces smooth. Grief is a truth and a tactic. They used it for both. When the last wagon creaked away and the yard settled into a blue hour, Ruth gathered the people in the clearing behind the quarters where the teaching tree had once spread its arms. The stump sat like a tooth broken to the gum. Old Moses raised his three-fingered hand and prayed, not for the dead so much as for the living, not for forgiveness so much as for a spine. "They're going to push," Samuel said when the amen thinned into the leaves. "They're going to pull," Ruth answered. "And we will hold. We will tell what we must and nothing else. We will keep our stories braided until the hand that tries to unplait them gets tired." She looked from face to face, counting not heads but resolve. "Tomorrow will be worse. Prepare your children to listen more than they speak. If you have letters, hide them. If you have books, burn them tonight and remember them tomorrow." She did not sleep. She sat at her table with the lamp turned low and copied the forged signature until her hand could make it without thought. She wrote 2 letters from Clara to herself on rough paper, dated 2 weeks back with news no one could check: weather in Georgia, a cousin's imagined trouble, gratitude for the Whitmore's Christian charity. She smudged one as if it had been carried in a pocket. She folded both and slid them into a drawer where a sheriff, searching, would be pleased to find exactly what he wanted. Across the fields, the river kept its counsel. Downstream, a skiff cut a small stitch in the current and vanished around a bend. In town, a telegraph key chattered late, carrying other people's certainties across wire. On a desk in Donovan's office, the forged bill of sale lay under a paperweight, its wax crest cooling toward the sort of truth that survives by being useful. And on the kitchen table of a woman who had learned to turn hunger into discipline, a magnolia petal rested beside a stub of pencil, a reminder that every trail worth following begins where decorum says, "You shouldn't have been." Tomorrow the sheriff would return with more questions and a fistful of telegrams. Tomorrow the coroner would bring a neat list of causes and quantities. But tonight, the quarter road was quiet, and the big house, for the first time in its history, learned what it meant to be truly empty. The truth did not arrive on horseback. It came on a thin copper vein that cut the county like a scar. At mid-morning, the telegraph key in Natchez clattered out a sentence with no mercy in it. No Belmont Plantation in Georgia. Never has been. By noon, Sheriff Donovan's boots hit the Whitmore kitchen like a gavel. He slapped the folded message against the table where bread had risen and verdicts had been whispered. "There is no Belmont," he said, voice low enough to be dangerous. "You've all been lying to me." 6 enslaved workers stood in a line, skirts starched, hands still. Ruth kept her breath even. She'd learned long ago that survival was a mirror. You give back only what a man wants to see. Behind her she could feel Letty's tremor, hear Samuel's measured inhale, sense fear moving through the room like heat. "Let's discuss what really happened to Clara," Donovan murmured. Ruth let tears rise, real ones, pulled from a well that never ran dry. "Since they sold her girls," she said, "she walked hollow. Said she had kin in Georgia who might help her find work. We were afraid of what sorrow might make her do." The truth wrapped the lie like cloth around a blade. Donovan studied each face. These were people trained from birth to bury their thoughts under polite obedience. He found nothing to grab but composure. Dr. Marcus Webb said little, but his eyes weighed everything. The forged bill of sale lay on the desk. Its ink settled into the paper's grain, the wax seal pressed with authority it didn't deserve. Webb bent, examining the signature's flourishes, the lazy loop of the C, the hooked tail of the S, then let his gaze drift to a scrap of pantry inventory pinned nearby. The same peculiar curl on the letter G, the same stubborn stroke. Handwriting survives its disguises. He filed the pattern away with the magnolia petal he'd slipped into his pocket that first day. Legal vultures had scented wealth. By afternoon, carriages lined the lane like a second fence. Distant cousins appeared with lawyers, who could count cotton bales and human beings on the same sheet of paper without flinching. With no white air left breathing in the big house, the Whitmore estate slid into a limbo that made flesh anxious. 47 enslaved people were suddenly columns in an argument. Technically owned, practically unassigned, vulnerable to anyone with a pen and nerve. The estate attorneys hired a temporary overseer to restore order. He arrived with a switch in his hand and a theology of pain. Patterson believed answers lived in fear. He started with the children, then the old, then anyone whose voice quavered when asked the same 3 questions. He starved the truth, separated families by a wall and a day, promised small mercies for large betrayals. The community held. They had rehearsed this part. "We know nothing," they said, because nothing was the only safe thing left to know. Word traveled faster than wagons. By evening, kitchens across Adams County had new rules. Silver bells gathered dust. Meals were tasted by trembling hands not meant for such work. Some planters sent their cooks away and ate badly on purpose. Appetite learned caution. Hospitality learned suspicion. The county breathed in, shallow and hot. On a dirt road 2 states away, Clara did not breathe at all for a dozen heartbeats while the wagon jolted over a rut. Then she let air in slow another practiced art. The driver, Josiah, a free black man with a patient jaw, flicked the reins and never turned his head. "Evening, Miss Coleman," he said to the air, using the name on the papers folded near Clara's ribs. "We'll make the river by dusk." The wagon boards hid compartments beneath their rattling cargo. She didn't need them today. Disguise can be quieter than a shadow. A head wrap tied a different way, a gait borrowed from a tired aunt, gloves that turned a scar into a rumor. At the landing, a steamboat coughed its way against the current, stacked with white families and crates and stories. Clara walked up the gangplank with a bucket and a washerwoman's slump. The ticket-taker glanced at her papers the way a man glances at rain, annoyed, not curious. In the colored section, she sat by a window and watched the bank slip by, a green world shucking its edge like corn. She kept her eyes on the water's shoulder, and her fingers light on a rosary she had chosen as a prop and kept for comfort. Back in Natchez, the reward went from a whisper to a number. $100, then $500, then a figure so large men on poor horses decided they might be bounty hunters. Handbills described her as 30, of middling height with a scar on the left hand. She had already drifted out of that description like a dress that never fit. Donovan sent riders out along every road and river crossing within 100 miles. He sent telegrams in all directions, wire stitching a net too late. "Check boarding houses, churches, colored schools, printing shops," he told sheriffs downriver. "Look for a woman working under a new name. Look for hands that have done kitchen work, but carry themselves like they're listening for something." Webb added one instruction of his own in a quiet note. compare ledgers, laundry lists, any scrap with a G in it. That night, in the quarters, Ruth gathered the children under the stump of the teaching tree and taught them without paper. A is for answer, short, she said. B is for breath, steady. C is for Clara, gone. She burned the last of the primer sheets at the fire's edge and watched the ash lift into a sky that owed them nothing. Knowledge travels well when it has to. Morning smuggled in a new cruelty. Donovan strode into the kitchen holding a fresh telegram. "The Belmont transfer is a fiction," he said, tossing the note onto the table so the crest of the sheriff's office kissed the forged crest of Whitmore wax. If Clara was sold, it wasn't to Georgia. Where did she go? Ruth met his eye. "Out of this house," she said. "That's the only direction we know. Your forged paper will hang you," Patterson hissed from the doorway. Ruth turned to him, voice cool as washwater. "Then let it hang the truth it wants to be." Webb watched the exchange and felt a splinter of sympathy he could not sand smooth. He had opened bodies all afternoon and found science where grief demanded a villain. Deliberate poisoning, yes, a crime without debate. But he had also read bills of sale with names of children written like livestock. He had watched a woman make a document of air and coffee grounds because the law had never once made a document of her. Paranoia multiplied. At Turner's place, every dish crossed the threshold only after a trembling taste. In town, shopkeepers eyed anyone buying lye or rat poison as if intent could be poured from a tin. A minister thundered that Satan lived in the kitchen. A shopkeeper muttered that literacy was a pest more dangerous than rats. People began using different words for the same fear. Nothing in a county travels faster. On the river, fear took another shape. A passenger in silk whispered to her friend that she no longer trusted the woman who had fried her eggs for 20 years. A traveling salesman declared loudly that property knew its place until abolitionists taught it sin. Clara kept her gaze on the brown water, which told the truth by never calling itself clean. In her bodice, a small glass vial pressed like a decision. Not a plan, a promise. 2 days later, a boy on stable duty at the courthouse ran in with breath to spare and eyes too wide. "Sheriff!" he panted. Letter came through the post, hand like the bill of sale. G all curled wrong. Donovan and Webb bent over the intercepted envelope like fortune-tellers. The message was brief. A woman calling herself Sarah, inquiring about 2 teachers in Ontario who matched the ages of daughters lost years ago. Hope leaves fingerprints. Webb felt the old ache of medicine, the knowledge that a body and a story can be broken clean through and still stagger on. He traced the curve of that telltale G. "She's on the move," he said. "And she's still herself." Donovan slammed his palm against the door jamb hard enough to make the courthouse dust jump. "Then we tighten everything," he snapped. "Riders to every ferry. Check the packet boats. Watch the boarding houses in Cincinnati and Louisville. If she wants Canada, she'll have to breathe American air a while longer." Patterson took the tightening as license. He prowled the quarters with a notebook, writing down who spoke to whom and how long they stood together to do it. He split mothers from sons for a day at a time. He cut rations to those who stammered. He did not notice how silence braided into something stronger than fear. He did not notice how, under orders to report every whisper, children learned to whisper only to the wind. Out beyond the county's imaginary border, Clara stepped off a boat into a morning that smelled of coal and wet rope. Cincinnati's Bucktown did not look like freedom, but it had corners where a woman could become ordinary. She traded fine gloves for rough work and a back staircase. She learned the names of people who minded their own business on purpose and would mind hers for a small kindness and a shared hymn. In a boarding house kitchen on Elm Street, she lifted a washtub and felt the ache in her left shoulder bloom with the cold. Old pain keeps good time. At the end of the week, a handbill with her description fluttered on a wall 3 blocks away. The scar, the height, the age, none of it fit clean anymore. Beneath the sketch, the reward had climbed high enough to make even good men's thoughts stray. Back in Mississippi, the Whitmore dead went to ground, each pine box stamped with a name that would outlast the body it trapped. Webb signed the papers with a steady hand and an unsteady conscience. Donovan sent another packet of telegrams and tried to sleep on a cot in his office with the window open to any breeze that might carry a new lead. The net had tightened. It had also widened. Both things can be true. On one side of it stood a county teaching itself to mistrust dinner. On the other moved a woman who had learned that patience is not the absence of action, but the discipline to act when the hour finally arrives. Her hour was not over. The wire had snapped. The hunt had shape. And the river, as ever, shrugged and kept its own counsel. The reward climbed like fever. $100 became $500, then $2,000, enough to turn farmhands into trackers and liars into witnesses. Handbills bloomed on courthouse doors and tavern posts. Negro woman about 30, scar left hand. The sketch looked like a dozen women, and exactly none of them. Men who had never noticed a cook's face now studied every black woman who passed, searching for a burn they would not recognize, even if she showed it to them. Sheriff Donovan widened the hunt until it touched 3 states. Riders sat at ferry slips on river islands, at crossroads where a single wrong turn could erase a life. Dogs came in from 2 counties over, noses trained on scraps from Clara's cabin, apron cloth, a sleeve. Ruth had rubbed those scraps with pepper and turpentine before handing them over. The hounds sneezed themselves in circles and called it work. In town, Dr. Marcus Webb worked a different trail. He returned to Clara's cabin with a quiet patience and the kind of attention that makes secrets nervous. Under the pallet, inside a slat, he found the thing that cracked the county open. A slim journal written in a cramped code that was half kitchen shorthand, half stubborn will. He spent hours with it, teasing meaning from marks. Recipes, yes, but not for food. Dosage tables, boiling points, notes on symptoms and timings in a clinician's voice, stolen from the far side of the hallway. And at the back, a list of names with dates like ledger entries underlined by rage. Henderson, Felix 23 Beauregard, 1845, Lancaster, 1846, Whitmore, 1847. Bodies were exhumed under the reluctant authority of men who hated what they were about to learn. Webb opened them in cellar light and wrote the same conclusion 4 times with a pen that did not tremble. Arsenic, deliberate. News galloped faster than justice. Kitchens across Mississippi sprouted new locks. Bell stayed silent. Some planters sent their cooks away and ate scorched meat with gratitude. Others made servants taste each dish on the threshold, turning supper into a ritual of suspicion. At the Whitmore place, order arrived with a switch. Patterson, the temporary overseer, believed terror squeezed truth like juice from cane. He separated families for clarity, withheld meals for memory, questioned children because their voices squeaked in ways he mistook for honesty. He got answers, but never the ones he could use. The community had rehearsed this play. Silence took turns, then held hands. When Patterson pressed a boy of 8, the child looked him straight and said, "She told me once poison is sweeter than sugar if you know how to serve it right." Patterson laughed, delighted by a child's nonsense. Ruth had coached the line to be just strange enough to be dismissed. Far from the big house, Clara moved the way a needle moves, small, precise, threading through cloth that had imagined itself seamless. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad and not underground. It was a memory shared between strangers, a discipline of quiet courage. A minister in Baton Rouge offered a hymn and a corner. A shopkeeper in Memphis poured coffee and asked no questions. Outside Nashville, a farmer's wife stitched a name into a cap and handed it to a woman she would never see again. Her best escape was ordinary. On a riverboat, Clara became a washerwoman with sore hands and a stoop that made men look over her without seeing her. At stations and stops, she lifted her eyes just enough to read the room, then set them back on water. Wood, cloth. She had turned her body into a tool years ago. Now it was a plan. A close call came at the Tennessee line. A slave catcher named Briggs, rope at his hip, swagger noisy as coin, reached a safe house hours late and found it emptied into quiet. Only Aunt Cora remained, a free black woman with bones older than the law. "You're hiding her," Briggs snarled. "Sir," Cora said, settling her shawl like a crown, "I'm 73. I can barely harbor my own breath." He stomped out without noticing fresh wheel ruts leading north, or the tremor in her hands after the door closed. Back in Natchez, Donovan grew the manhunt the way a tree grows rings, tight, unpretty, inevitable. He dictated wire after wire. Check boarding houses, post offices, church registers. Watch for woman using aliases, Sarah or... The clerk's key rattled, and the county's pride traveled down copper like gossip with a badge. Webb added a note of his own to sheriffs upriver. Compare handwriting on ledgers, laundry lists. Look for a peculiar G with a curled foot. The body can change its posture. The hand keeps old habits. By the fourth day, professional slave catchers arrived, men who could read crushed grass and broken reeds the way lawyers read a contract. They brought dogs trained on Clara's apron. The animals sniffed pepper and coughed, circled and whined. In the quarters, children counted the seconds between bell strokes as if they could measure safety. Ruth burned the last remnants of the teaching tree's chalk and kept the lessons in mouths and minds. "I for answer," she told the group in whispers. "Short B for breath, quiet, C for Clara, gone." Clara reached Ohio with the ache in her shoulder, waking under the cold. Cincinnati's Bucktown took her in the way a city takes in rain, absorbing it into gutters and shadows, shining it back as reflection. Mrs. Washington's boarding house on Elm Street smelled of starch and frying onions. "Name?" the owner asked, chin lifted with the defiance that comes from years of saying nothing. "Sarah Coleman," Clara said, and then, when the door closed and the room was hers for a moment, the truth to the air. Adonai. The name her mother had given her before sale made names into receipts. Beloved. She said it again, tasting a country that did not exist on any map the sheriff could consult. She took work that matched her disguise, laundry before dawn, floors that learned her patience, a kitchen that answered to her hands without asking who she had been yesterday. At night she listened. Rivermen carried information the way their boats carried timber, rough, necessary, full of splinters. She collected scraps and stitched roots, a Quaker meeting 2 streets over that prayed with its sleeves rolled, a printer who could be trusted with a single page and a careful lie, a ferryman who closed one eye at the right moment and pretended it was the wind. In Mississippi, the investigation fattened on anger. State lawyers argued over acres and human bodies in the same breath, eyes sliding off the kitchen door like guilt. Donovan interrogated until his voice rasped. Webb's autopsy notes stacked into a narrow monument to precision and horror. The county wanted a spectacle, an arrest, a rope, a statement about the natural order that would tuck children into bed again. It got rumors instead. Rumor said Clara had jumped a night train dressed as a man. Rumor said she'd drowned herself rather than hang. Rumor said she lived in a cave upriver like an outlaw saint, curing the sick and poisoning the wicked. Rumor turned a woman's planning into magic, because magic is easier to forgive than arithmetic. Then a deputy in the mailroom brought Donovan a letter intercepted under new precautions, and rumor hardened into a direction. A neat hand, that same telltale G, inquiring about 2 teachers in Ontario. Grace and Patience, ages near grown. Hope leaves tracks deeper than fear. Webb touched the paper as if it could burn. "She's writing ahead," he said. "Not fleeing nowhere, going somewhere." "Then we go there first," Donovan snapped. "Cincinnati, Louisville, every crossing to the north. I want riders on both banks. If she breathes, I want to know which side of the river draws the air." Patterson took the order as permission to invent new cruelties. He lined the staff in the yard at dusk and made them stand until the moon found them, punishing their silhouettes for what their mouths would not give. He split mothers from babies overnight, betting panic against loyalty. He found nothing but a silence that had learned to feed itself. Clara's network moved her again, not like a parade, but like weather. Felt, not seen. A Quaker family outside the city hid her under quilts stitched with scripture and maps. A deacon taught her the names of men who would not betray her for any price the handbills could print. A woman with a scar like Clara's, different shape, same story, pressed a packet of pins and a small glass vial into her palm and closed her fingers over both. "For mending," she said. "Of one kind or another." She wrote one letter she knew was a risk and a necessity, to a school in Ontario where 2 teachers matched the rumors she had carried like a relic. She asked nothing that would expose them. She asked only whether they accepted new students and whether hymns were sung on Thursdays. She signed it in a steady hand that betrayed her only to people who were already looking. The knock would come later. The chase, the pier, the water that makes witnesses of no one, that belonged to another hour. Now in the narrow middle between pursuit and revelation, the county held its breath and called it vigilance. Donovan spread maps across a table and pinned them with tacks where deaths and sightings made uneasy neighbors. Webb traced routes with a surgeon's finger and felt, without quite naming it, a pattern under the skin, a line not random at all but drawn true as wire. In Bucktown, The boarding house went quiet after lights out. In the bed by the window, a woman lay awake with a rosary she was learning how to believe in, whispering 3 names into the dark, like a proof that could hold even when the room was searched. Grace, Patience, Adoni. Outside, the river rolled by, pretending to be only water. Inside, nets tightened and needles threaded, each believing itself the stronger. The knock came like a verdict. 4 sharp blows at 4:17 a.m. When even lies are too sleepy to run upstairs, boards creaked and breath caught. Mrs. Washington wrapped her robe tight and met the door with practiced confusion. "Officers at this hour?" she asked, stepping aside before they could push. They pushed anyway. Deputy Marshal Franklin with a badge that gleamed like a threat, and behind him 3 slave catchers smelling of wet leather and cheap Triumph. Briggs led them, rope looped at his hip, eyes that had learned to love a cornered thing. "We're looking for a woman," Franklin said. "Goes by Sarah Coleman. Other names too. Negro, about 30. Scar on the left hand." On the back stair, Clara had already risen. She moved without noise through a room that knew her weight. The ache in her left shoulder woke in the cold and tried to slow her. She told it no. She lifted the small bundle always ready. Spare dress, the forged papers, $37, and a vial that pressed between her ribs like a promise. The window was too narrow, the cellar a trap. Sometimes the only way out is through. She tied a different headscarf as she walked, bent her spine 2 decades, and picked up a tin basin. When Franklin nearly collided with her in the hallway, she startled like a washerwoman caught where she shouldn't be, and dropped the basin. Water slapped his boots. "Lord, sir, you scared me," she said, voice pitched older, rougher. "Come for linens early is all." Franklin glanced once, annoyed. Briggs did not. "Predators know when the world goes very still." "Your hands," he said. "Let me see your hands." She held up the right, wet and unremarkable, both. A door upstairs slammed. A boarder shouted. Mrs. Washington argued on purpose. The half-second cracked the air. Clara flung what water remained in Briggs's face and ran. She took stairs 2 at a time, cut left where the hall narrowed, and broke into the waking street. Dawn cracked the sky like an egg, leaking pale light onto slick cobbles. Shouts followed, then boots. "That's her!" Briggs roared, rope uncoiling. "500 to the man who stops her." The number tilted the city. Dockmen who might have looked away now saw rent paid and meat salted. Clara ran. Elm Street funneled her toward the river, that brown shoulder rolling like a beast pretending to sleep. She slid into an alley, leapt a fence, scattered chickens. A dog lunged and missed her hem by a prayer. Her breath came like sewing, quick, even stitches. The city woke around her, vendors lifting shutters, girls with baskets pausing to stare, a priest stepping aside without blessing. She reached the waterfront. Steamboats hunched at their moorings, smoke drawing questions in the air. Men with hooks turned to watch. Franklin's voice carried, "Stop her! 500!" The crowd rearranged itself into a trap. Nothing malicious, only math. Clara stopped at the pier's end. Water slapped the pilings below, high from September rain. 7 men fanned into a semicircle. Briggs stepped forward, rope ready. "It's over," he said, savoring the word. Adoni. Hearing the name they were never meant to know struck like a slap. Clara's hand found the vial. She held it up so the morning made it glint. "Your law says I am property," she said, voice level. "Says my daughters were property. Says our grief is a nuisance to your sleep. I reject your law." Franklin softened his tone, the way a man speaks to a ledge. "Whatever was done to you, this isn't the way. You want to talk of ways?" Clara's laugh was dry as lie. "What way is it to sell a baby? What way is it to make a woman say thank you for sorrow?" Behind the men, people gathered, free, flax Irish dockhands, women with loaves still warm in their cloths. Even the river seemed to lean in. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind. "Drink it and you die a thief and a murderer," Briggs said. "Come quiet and you die by the law." "Either way I die," Clara said. "This way is mine." A man shouldered past the line then, breathless, hat askew. Dr. Marcus Webb, soot from the train smudged at his cuff. "Wait," he said, not to the officers, but to Clara alone, as if this scene were only 2 people in a room. He held nothing. Out. No paper to wave, no badge to brandish, only a fact he had chased through ledgers and whispers until it bruised his sleep. Your daughters, Webb said. I traced them. Clara did not move. Hope is a cruel muscle, it clenched anyway. They were sold, yes, Webb continued, careful voice built for bad news that insists on its footing. But not separated. A Quaker family bought them both, took them to Canada. They're teachers now. You lie, she said, and the words came easy from a life that had made lying a profession, but her bottom lip trembled despite her training. Grace has your hands, Webb said, unable to keep the wonder from his face. Precise, careful. Patience sings in the church choir. They use the names you gave them, not the ones the bills of sale tried to keep, Briggs cursed. Enough preaching, he snapped, stepping closer. Take her. Clara lifted the vial to her mouth. The men flinched. Behind them the crowd breathed in and held. She lowered it. What do they call me? She asked Webb, not looking at the others. In their letters, Webb asked, telling his own lie to save her. Mother. The river struck the pilings once, twice, like a hand finding a rhythm. Clara measured the distance to the water, the boot's closeness, the strength left in her legs, the way her shoulder might complain on impact. She saw the rope and the ropes tomorrow. She saw a cold room and the quiet that follows a drop. She saw a schoolroom far away, chalk dust floating like mercy, and two young women who did not know how close the law stood at their door. She smiled then, a small private thing that had nothing to do with victory. Tell them, she said softly to Webb, to the water, to anyone who would carry words. Tell them their mother loved them enough to become what the world called her anyway. The men lunged. Clara turned and leapt. For a blink, she hung in air like a final note. Then the Ohio took her, the cold closing around every scar she carried, with a hiss. The crowd cried out, some in triumph, some in horror, some in something they would not name later. Franklin shouted for boats. Briggs swore at physics. Two dockmen threw lines, another tossed a barrel that rolled like a bad idea and spun away. Clara went under, then up, then under again. The river was high and mean. She coughed once and tasted mud, silt, faraway farms. The ache in her shoulder became a star of pain. She kicked her angle across the current, not with it. A boy on the wharf pointed. There! A skiff slammed down from its rope, 3 men already in it, oars biting. Webb watched, heart a-fist, and hated how part of him marveled at the body's insistence on living. He lost her in a boil of brown and found her near a tangle of driftwood, a hand, gloved, impossibly flashing, then gone. The skiff reached the spot and cut circles into emptiness. Drag the bank, Franklin barked. All day if we have to. Boats crisscrossed the water until oarsmen swore their arms were made of fire. The river took it calmly, shrugging off. Their insistence, holding what it meant to hold, giving back only stain and rumor. A woman said she saw a dark shape slip between 2 pilings and vanish upriver, which made no sense to anyone but the current. A fisherman swore he heard singing under the water and crossed himself after he said it. By mid-morning, the handbills might as well have been eulogies. Briggs spat into the river, called it names, and claimed the reward anyway with the logic of a man who thinks the story ends when he gets bored. Franklin stood with boots on the pier's edge and stared at the moving line between this shore and the other, a border that pretended to be simple. Webb did not move. He watched the water until the reflection of the sun shattered into coins and turned his eyes to ache. In his pocket, a magnolia petal, now dry, now fragile, crumpled to dust under the press of his hand. At dusk, the drag. Lines came back with riverweed and a length of rope that had tied someone else's life to a cleat. The men on the skiff shook their heads without looking at the dock. The crowd thinned to something like shame. Without a body, Franklin muttered to no one. We have nothing. But the way he said it sounded like a man asking God for an easier job. Night settled. The search boat's lanterns winked on like uncertain stars. The river went on, keeping its counsel the way an old friend keeps your worst secret. Far downstream, a farmer rose before first light to find his skiff unmoored and a dress drying on a willow branch, neat as Sunday. His wife counted the clothesline and found 2 garments missing and said nothing. She warmed broth and left it on the hearth as if for herself. Sometimes charity is simply the absence of a question. Back in Bucktown, Mrs. Washington scrubbed her hallway twice, and told the neighbors she did not know what all the noise had been about. She gathered a handful of coins from a jar and placed exactly $37 on a windowsill across town, where a deacon would find it and know which cupboard to fill. She folded a headscarf and pressed it flat with her palm, as if blessing the idea of a woman who did not drown. Sheriff Donovan wrote his report by lamplight, with a hand that had stopped shaking years ago and discovered it could learn again. "Fled into river," he wrote. "Presumed drowned." Webb put his pen away. He had told the truth he could bear, and lied to save what the truth would have broken. Outside his window, the Ohio went on pretending to be only water. Inside, he sat very still, feeling the stubborn life of a story that would not end with a splash. On the far bank, somewhere between mud and reeds and the next name, a woman with a gloved left hand walked bent for a while, then straightened, then walked on. They dragged the river for 3 days and found everything but the thing they wanted: a broken crate, a length of tarred rope, one boot without its pair, the rumor of a hymn. Fishermen said the current in late September could take a body 20 miles in a day, could wedge it under drowned trees, could lay it gentle in a silt bank and pull a blanket of mud to the chin. Sheriff Donovan told the crews to keep at it. He said it like a prayer and heard it like a lie. "No body, no proof," he muttered. But proof is a skittish animal. It doesn't come for whistling. By October 1st, the lanterns on the search skiffs burned like tired stars. Webb stood on the Cincinnati docks, with hands in his pockets and the river's breath in his coat. "We'll need to call it," Franklin said. He said it to the water. The water did not answer. Donovan signed the note he knew he would have to write. Fled into river, presumed drowned downstream. A farmer woke to find his skiff missing, and 2 damp spaces on the clothesline where a dress and a man's shirt had been. His wife said nothing. Heated broth, left it covered on the hearth and moved the remaining pins in the basket, so the gaps weren't obvious. Charity is sometimes an arrangement of objects that tells a story no one will repeat. In Natchez, the Whitmore estate went to auction before the ground above the family had fully settled. Men assessed the land with eyes that saw only yield, then turned to the people who had made that yield possible, and counted them with the same math. 47 souls broken into lots. Ruth was sent north to a plantation near Jackson, where the fields ran flatter, and the overseer's smile had fewer teeth. Samuel went west where iron sang different songs in the forge. Old Moses did not travel far. Winter took him with the gentleness life had not. They wrote each other when they could not risk writing, through the hands of itinerant preachers, in the margins of ledgers that would never be audited, in hymns that lodged phrases where letters could not live. The teaching tree was gone, burned to a stump and ash, but lessons kept their feet. Answer short, but breath steady. Said Clara gone, not forgotten. Patterson lasted 2 months in his next position and died of what the papers called dysentery. The women in the quarters laid him out with the same competence they had used on their own dead, and no one could tell where disease ended and intention began. Clara had taught more than letters under that oak. Fear learned new routes in the county. Kitchen doors grew locks. Shopkeepers wrote names when rat poison was purchased and asked questions about lye. Some planters required every dish to be tasted twice before it crossed a threshold, once by a housemaid and once by the man who had ordered the tasting. Hospitality learned to look over its shoulder at its own table. Webb returned to Mississippi with a river's grit still in his shoes and a compromise coiled in his chest. He completed the autopsy reports with neat hands. Arsenic deliberate, no doubt. He wrote the conclusions the law needed and kept the questions his conscience asked for himself. At night he reopened the small journal from Clara's cabin, the cramped code he'd learned to read, until it felt like hearing a voice in another room. Between dosages and boiling points lay a mother's arithmetic. Money saved, days counted, scraps of roots, and on one page, 2 names underlined hard enough to scar the paper: Grace, Patience. When autumn thinned to bone, Webb bought his own ticket north. He told no one. He followed a thread the way a surgeon follows a vessel, patient, sure, ready to tie it off if it bled too much truth. In a small Ontario town, he found a schoolroom where slates clicked like slow rain, and children's voices braided psalm and alphabet. 2 young women taught at the front, poise carefully chosen, eyes that measured a room the way a general might, hands that knew how to coax order from noise. Miss Freeman. He asked softly after the lesson, to one and then the other. They exchanged a glance that had years in it. "We've heard," said the older Grace, folding those precise hands in her lap when they sat. "They say our mother did terrible things." "Terrible," Webb answered, surprising himself, and carefully measured. "Those two do not always meet." Patience's voice was a riverbank, quiet, shifting, stubborn against the push. "What do you want from us, Doctor?" "Nothing," he said, and realized it was true. "Only to tell you that someone crossed the country on wires and roads and water to find you. That she learned a language no one taught her, because the world refused her the words she needed. That she turned a kitchen into a laboratory and a ledger into a map. That when the choice came, she took the kind of freedom the river knows." Grace looked at his hands, not his face. "We remember flour on a table," she said. "Letters traced with a finger and blown off with a laugh so no one would see. We remember singing when there was nothing else to do. We remember being loved by someone who could not keep us." She turned away so the room would not watch her eyes. "We will not give statements for your papers." "I didn't ask," Webb said. He left them with nothing they didn't already have, because everything they needed had crossed a border ahead of him. Back in Cincinnati, the city grew colder and talk grew warmer. Sightings bloomed where winter does. A woman with a gloved left hand buying horehound at a market. A washerwoman singing an old tune in a dialect most ears could not place. Money left in exact amounts on a preacher's sill, $37 again and again, as if generosity had adopted a signature. The boarding house on Elm Street returned to its rhythm. Mrs. Washington scrubbed her hallway, replaced a broken hinge, and learned a new habit, listening for footsteps before dawn that were not there. Donovan closed his file on December 22nd with a line that would age well for the men who needed it to. Clara, Negro woman, cook, deceased by drowning while fleeing arrest for murder. Case closed. He signed it with a hand that had stopped shaking. Then he went home and could not fall asleep for an hour that turned into 2. And when his wife asked what troubled him, he said weather and did not know whether he meant the air or the thing that moves inside a man when he stands on a dock and watches a river refuse a body. On Christmas Eve, Webb found an unmarked envelope under the door of his rented room. No seal, no handbill bravado. Inside lay a single pressed magnolia blossom, browned at the edges yet still faintly sweet. A flower that did not grow this far north without willingness. No note, no flourish. He burned it the way he would cauterize a wound, to stop a bleeding only he could see. But smoke keeps its own counsel. And as it climbed the chimney, he caught the ghost of a kitchen summer and a riverbank night, and decided some truths were better trusted to current than to courts. Winter carried them into a new year. In Jackson, Ruth found a corner of a smokehouse where children could learn the alphabet of survival, with salted pork overhead, like thunder you could eat. "Eh," she told them, shaping the letter in the air. "Answer short." "B," and she breathed with them until they matched her. "C," and her mouth trembled but did not break. "Clara gone," she said, "and the road still here. Up north." A woman who preferred to be called by names that floated. Martha sometimes. Mrs. Washington other times, practiced becoming older in the mirror, and learned a stoop that hid a height that had once run the length of a pier. She tucked a vial into the back of a drawer and chose different tools. Ladles, ledgers, and arrangement of trust. She sent money in odd sums that might read as bookkeeping errors to anyone who wasn't keeping the same book. She learned the routes between safe doors and the right knocks that opened them. She folded 3 words into a letter she never mailed, "My daughters," free, and put it behind a loose board where secrets sit like moths in wait-out seasons. The county's appetite for spectacle soured into a cautious hygiene. Ministers preached about serpents in kitchens. Planters put locks on pantries and saved their most fervent prayers for stew. The law congratulated itself on its steady hand and did not remark on the places where that hand trembled. The river, asked every day in the mind of one man and the whisper of another whether it had a body to give back, rolled on and did what rivers do, carried what it had been entrusted with and pretended to be only water. Some nights Webb dreamed of a magnolia petal falling onto a kitchen floor, the small evidence of a root taken at midnight. Some mornings Ruth woke with the taste of coffee and grease-aged paper on her tongue and wrote a signature in the air until the muscle remembered. Donovan went about his circuit with a clean record and a dirty question that never washed. What kind of justice needs a rope to quiet a story? And somewhere between Cincinnati and the places that speak French in their churches, a woman with a careful walk learned how to make herself invisible in newer, quieter ways. She traded the sharp edges of danger for the long practice of usefulness. She trained her hands to season without thinking, and her mind to notice without staring. She became the kind of person people confided in without remembering later that they had. The river had kept its secret. She kept her own. When the thaw came, the Ohio loosened its shoulders and released sticks, barrels, a crate, a boot that finally found its pair. It did not release a woman. In Ontario, 2 teachers opened the schoolhouse windows to let in a wind that smelled like mud and possibility. In Jackson, Ruth lit a candle and began again. In Natchez, the Whitmore headstones settled into their small chatter with the rain. In a northern boarding house, a gloved left hand polished a ladle, set it down, and reached for a ledger whose numbers never balanced, but whose sums made sense. The map lay under water now, traced in silt and rumor, in ledgers and hymns, in the odd insistence of $37 appearing where it most mattered. The county declared itself finished. The river smiled the way water does when people assign it verbs, and the story, which had learned how to breathe even when men said it could not, turned the page toward a city where fire would one day redraw. The streets and a boarding house kitchen would teach recipes with intentions measured like prayer. Chicago learned to wear its soot like pride. In a brick boarding house on State Street, an older woman called herself Martha Washington and made a kitchen into a small republic. Her left hand stayed gloved. Victorian propriety, people said. In truth, it was habit and camouflage. She trained young cooks to season with intention. Taste twice, she taught, once for flavor, once for consequence. Money began to appear where it mattered most. $37 pressed beneath a church door. 37 in a deacon's hatband misplaced during collection. 37 tucked into a widow's Bible. Odd sums turned to rumor that moved faster than streetcars. An unseen benefactor seeding schools for colored children, paying for coal, for books, for a teacher's winter shoes. The Chicago Tribune ran a curious line in 1867 about a donor with peculiar sums. No name, only the arithmetic of a conscience that preferred quiet. The fire of 71 redrew whole neighborhoods, but not the route to Martha's back steps. Smoke thinned, rumor didn't. In the ash came a letter from Mississippi, to Dr. Marcus Webb's son, among the papers of a dead man who had never fully learned how to sit with what he knew. Webb's last confession admitted the county's clean ending was a lie he'd signed so the river could keep one truth. Some justice, he wrote, lives outside the noose. His son burned the confession after reading it twice, but words imprint deeper than ash. He kept a pressed magnolia petal in a book he never lent. In the spring of 1868, 2 women arrived at Martha's parlor with the careful grace of people who practiced dignity the way others practiced scales. They introduced themselves as Grace and Patience Freeman, teachers from Ontario. Voices steady, hands precise, eyes that measured a room before letting it measure them. They called the landlady Mrs. Washington. A seam trembled in the world and held. They sat for 2 hours while the kettle hissed and cooled and hissed again. They spoke of their students and hymn days, and the first snow a child sees from inside a warm room. They did not use the word mother. They spoke it sideways. The way one woman's careful hands had taught flour to make letters on a table. The way 2 girls were told knowledge was the only thing they couldn't sell. The way a voice had sung a song that remembered a language older than the whip. At the door, Grace folded those recognizable hands in her lap and said, "We understand." Then, after a small silence that tasted of iron and honey, understanding and forgiving aren't the same river. They left letters behind for years after, formal, grateful, signed your daughters in freedom. Martha kept them with $37 and a vial she no longer needed. Students came and went, fugitives who weren't fugitives anymore, freedmen who were still learning how freedom eats, girls who wanted wages, and boys who wanted to live long enough to decide what they wanted. Martha taught them how to change a gait, a voice, a presence, how to read a room faster than a man draws breath, how to make a document earn its lie. Every scar tells a story, she told them when they asked about her hand. Some you tell, Some you let the river keep. One winter evening in 1882, a young woman knocked, eyes watchful, hands careful. "Clara Freeman," she said, and the name hit the room like the first crack of lightning before a summer storm. Patience's daughter. She'd come to study medicine the way water studies rock, by wearing it down. Schools said no. She apprenticed to whoever would let her slippers in the doorway. Martha taught her chemistry disguised as recipes, dosing disguised as tea. She taught her to count breaths and pulses, to trust what a tongue can taste that a man won't admit. "Why tell me the harm?" the girl asked one night, looking at a jar that could end a beating heart the way a curtain ends a scene. "Because power needs ethics," Martha answered, "and ethics needs power. Keep them together." Martha died in 1885, a winter night gentle as a folded cloth. The certificate said heart failure. The granddaughter found a measured dose in a cup and understood. Even her ending belonged to her. At the funeral, a veiled white woman left a single magnolia blossom on the coffin and vanished. No one recognized her until someone did. Emma Whitmore, the child who had died first at the birthday supper. Except she had not. This was the secret the river hadn't needed to keep. The children at that table had been given something else. Clara's arithmetic spared innocence. With a measured deceit, enough to mimic death, to slow and still, then wake, hours later carried out under a pall, traded to abolitionists by servants who refused to be executioners to anyone who hadn't earned a sentence. Emma grew up in the North with a name that did not have to dodge a history. She came to the funeral because gratitude is a pilgrimage, not a letter. She left the blossom because apology didn't fit the shape of the day. Somewhere in those years, the county's story hardened into a cautionary plaque men could point to when they wanted to feel secure. She poisoned 12. She drowned. The law prevailed. The plaque did not mention a boarding house where recipes doubled as textbooks, a schoolhouse window open to Ontario wind, or a girl named for a grandmother who chose medicine because life had spent too long practicing death. It did not mention a sheriff who stared at water and asked harder questions than his badge allowed. It did not mention $37 again and again, signing its name with numbers. The boarding house lived past Martha, run by the hands she'd steadied. It fed men who laid tracks and women who studied at tables they scrubbed themselves. It sent boys to jobs where Sir paid a little more this week than last. It taught girls to read bills of sale and burn them when the lesson was done. It kept a locked cabinet for spices and other substances, and a ledger that never balanced, but whose deficits were the right kind. In 1923, the building came down to make room for something taller with clean angles. A worker found a journal in the wall behind a lathe board, pages browned, writing tight, the curl on the G unmistakable even after decades in dust. There were tables of dosages that could pass for medicine if you didn't know which cupboard they'd been kept in. There were routes that still matched maps. There were names, some crossed out like debts paid. The last page held only 4 words in a hand that had learned to keep its tremor out of sight. "My daughters are free." The foreman showed the book to a newspaperman who squinted and saw no circulation in it. The worker took the journal home instead, gave it to a sister who kept a shelf of things worth more than money, and the story stayed where it likes to live best, between seasoning and serving, in kitchens that measure more than salt, in hands that taste consequence before spice. What remains? A doctrine of intention, a map underwater, a signature in odd sums. The knowledge that patience is not passive, that arithmetic can become revolt, that a kitchen may be a laboratory and a sanctuary and a war room at once. And names, chosen, kept, traded, rescued. Adeni become Clara, become Martha, become the woman who died on her own terms and lived on hers too. In Natchez, the Whitmore stones softened into moss and rain. In Jackson, Ruth students taught their children to answer short and breathe steady and keep what must be kept. In Ontario, a bell rang for morning lessons, and 2 teachers with careful hands smoothed their skirts and opened their primers. In Chicago, a granddaughter set a measuring spoon on a counter and recited, without thinking, the rule that had come down to her like an heirloom: taste twice. Some nights the wind along State Street still carries a scent that doesn't belong to weather, magnolia and metal, onion and something older, reminding whoever breathes it that justice sometimes comes plated, and that history is a recipe you alter on purpose. People say the river never returned her. Perhaps it did what it always does, carried what it was given to the place where it belonged. Perhaps the body was never the point. The point was a message that crossed borders without stamps and outlived every hand that tried to erase it. My daughters are free.